Who was Saint Monica, and how can Christians today be encouraged by her example? This is what's coming up with Pastor Tom Peach. So, Tom, first of all, when does the church remember Monica?
Well, there's a bit of a story in it. So she's remembered on the 27th of August. Usually saints are remembered on the day of their death. I think she died on the 4th of May. But the church has moved her feast to the 27th because her famous son Augustine is celebrated the next day, on the 28th of August.
Lovely.
Yeah, great. And that says already a little bit about Monica.
Yeah, so tell us a bit more about who this character in the church's history was, Monica.
She's known as being, she's the mother of St Augustine, who's one of the great saints of the church, changed the church in a way, a Western civilization. We're in the Lutheran tradition. Luther was an Augustinian monk. But Augustine, you could say, would not have been a Christian were it not for his mother. We're talking about North Africa. It's in the 4th century. She has a husband who is not a Christian, really, a son who leaves the faith, and she becomes this model of persistent prayer, of dogged prayer, if you like, of focusing on the one thing needed, which is the gospel for her husband and her son and maybe other kids as well. And almost like the widow in the gospel who just hounds the judge for righteousness, Monica becomes this great saint and model for the church of just hounding on God's door in some ways with tears, lots of tears.
Because Augustine was a bit of a wild child, right?
You name it, he did it. Well, look, who knows, but certainly he was. And she just would not give up. She prayed no matter what he was doing. You know, there's another Bible text that I'm reminded of at the beginning of Job. Do you remember? It talks about how Job was a righteous man, and one of the evidences for this is when his sons would go out partying and invite his daughters, and they'd all have a nice time. They'd eat and drink, it says, and Job would get up in the morning and offer prayers and sacrifices for them, just in case they sinned. And Monica was like this for her son Augustine, who was very bright, moved away from home, moved to a kind of the big smoke to continue his learning, gave up any kind of faith that he had, and lived a good life a little bit, but also got swayed by all sorts of trendy, philosophical, heretical kind of sects at the time. And she just stayed with him, almost annoyingly so. You know, when you're a teenager and your mum just won't let you go, Monica just wouldn't let Augustine go. There's a great story about that. He gets a job in Rome. It's a huge promotion. He becomes sort of a professor of philosophy. She follows him to the port at Carthage, and she doesn't want him to go, begging him not to go. And he says, "Oh, it's all right, Mum, I've just got to go see a friend," or something like this. And he steals off to Rome in the middle of the night or early morning without telling her, because he just knows she's going to follow him. And he just wants to get away from this pesky helicopter mum who's persisting in this prayer. I mean, he says, she cried for me. She shed more tears than most mothers do when their kids die. She just wouldn't let up.
It's a wonderful example, isn't it? And all of the things you mentioned have begun to, inform the sorts of ways that Christians today would be encouraged by her example and imitate her example. But perhaps you can flesh that out a bit more and talk about how can we today look to a figure like Monica and be encouraged? What particular sorts of people or vocations may look to Monica for Christian encouragement?
Every Christian can look to Monica, especially those who have family members, people they love who aren't in the church. Monica is just a beautiful example of this. It's the one thing she focuses on in her life at the expense of all else. She ends up following Augustine over to Rome and Milan after a while. She pesters the bishop, right, Ambrose, and says, "Please, you've got to talk to my son. You've got to knock some sense into him." Pastors sometimes are not unfamiliar with requests like this. And he says, there's no use. This guy is too far gone. It's going to be throwing my pearls before swine. And she just won't give up. She keeps pestering him day and night, crying and saying, "You've got to go talk some sense into him." And he loses patience and actually says, "Go away. No son over whom so many tears have been shed is going to be lost."
It's a beautiful line.
It's a glorious line. And so there's an example for all Christians here for some persistence. Ambrose knew that Monica's prayers were going to do more than what he could do. in this context.
And that is a huge emphasis, just in my pastoral ministry in the church. This is a concern that so many folk have, particularly in their old age, for their children and for their grandchildren. They feel helpless. There's a number of other challenges going on in these people's lives, sometimes huge health things, but I can tell you their number one concern on their heart is for their children and grandchildren and the faith. And Monica's the one to look to for the sort of example.
And you can read her story in Augustine's book, The Confessions. It's sort of like his autobiography, where he goes back and tells the story of his mother and his own conversion, and the conversion which finally came and which Monica received with great joy. And it's not something that we all live to see in our lifetimes, but there's I think reading Monica, we get to journey with her, this sorrowful journey of having family members outside the faith, and even though rejoice with her, even though our joy may not yet be complete ourselves too, she's a model both of the prayer and tears and passion that goes into this, but also of the joy. Finally, when he does convert, she says, "There's nothing really left for me." It's like St Simeon. "Now, Lord, let your servant depart in peace." She says this to him, and she dies 9 days later. Right. It's sort of like the focus of her life. So in that sense too, there's something for people who have children who are in the church, or family members who are in the church too, that this is the one thing needed in a way, something to cherish, to build your lives around. If there's a choice between church or sport, Monica will help you to choose the church. This is the one thing needed, the one thing worth giving our lives for.
And when I think of Monica too, and I love this story. I love the story of Monica. I've quoted it in sermons and in various settings for teaching. And one of the things that occurs to me about her as a figure is you have this great figure of Augustine, and by his own admission, none of the massive influence that he had would have happened without this humble, quiet, in her time, relatively unknown saint. And it's a real encouragement to the quiet, humble Christian life, persisting in prayer behind the scenes, not needing to be out there in a big figure, that sort of emphasis.
Church history is just wonderful for this, the kind of domino effect and the causality that you can, because without Monica we don't have an Augustine, without Augustine we don't have a Luther, you could say too, and without Luther we don't have our church, and we don't have the refreshing teaching of salvation by grace through faith that was revived in later centuries, and so Monica, this humble woman whom most of us haven't heard of, plays this pivotal role. Just like in Old Testament history too, these minor figures that through which you trace the lineage that ends up in our Lord Jesus himself too.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thanks for being on again today to talk about St Monica. The church remembers her on August the 27th. This quiet, humble saint, persistent in prayer for her son's conversion and her husband's, and through those prayers, God did amazing things. This is Kairos. God bless you.